Quis custodiet ipsos custodes? Who will guard the guards themselves? Or maybe something you all might be a bit more familiar with. Who watches the Watchmen? Since the show went on hiatus, a couple interesting things happened that I wanted to take a bit of a deeper dive around. Incidents where people and technology that we rely on to protect our own systems and security were met with trouble themselves. In July, two stories really stood out to me in the cyberspace. They're stories I've discussed with my friends, my family, and my coworkers. So now, I want to talk about them with you. The first one I'm sure you're acutely aware of. It was the day the Earth stood still while Crowdstrike held millions of systems in limbo due to a faulty upgrade. What happened there, and how do we learn from it? The second one you might not be as familiar with. What do you do when the company you charge for teaching and learning about cybersecurity is caught accidentally hiring a foreign spy? The short story, you use it as a learning experience. The long story, well, stick around and we'll chat about that too. I'm John Cordes, and on this episode of the show, I'm going to talk to you about what the shell is going on out there in the world of cybersecurity that even those who we look to for protection are being got. On July 19th, 2024, the world saw what was quite possibly the biggest disruption in technology that I can recall. Honestly, it reminded me of everything that people said was going to happen during Y2K back in 2000. Planes were grounded, hospitals stalled, and even emergency services were hit. Myself, I was on a bus tour over in Scotland when this happened. I remember popping open my phone to see a couple tweets and posts in the InfoSec community about a bad update to Crowdstrike, but at first I didn't really think too much of it. Then I popped over to Reddit to check on some news for the day, and the cybersecurity subreddits that I follow saw more posts about it. Now, that's not inherently uncommon. People talk in the community. It's a community. But the post had hundreds and hundreds of comments on something that was only hours old, and it was still pretty early in the day in Scotland, so the US people weren't even really waking up just yet. I started to look into what was actually happening, and it was alarming, to say the least. So let's step back, because I think we're at a point where most of you are familiar with this. You all heard about the outage, but might have some questions like, okay, but what is CrowdStrike? Why didn't my own computer get hit if this was so widespread? Was this a cyber attack? Well, let's dive in, maybe in that order, right? I want to start with CrowdStrike. For those of you who aren't directly in the field, this might be the first time you've heard that name. Basically, they're a massive provider of cybersecurity services and products. It ranges from services like support to software. In this case, the product we want to focus on is the endpoint detection and response systems that they offer, or an EDR solution for short. I want you to imagine your computer or your phone as a busy, bustling city, right? Just like a city needs security to protect it from threats like burglars and vandals, your computer needs protection from cyber threats like viruses or hackers. An EDR system is like a security team for each individual device. It continuously monitors the device for any suspicious activity or threats, much like security cameras and patrols keep an eye on your city. If the EDR system detects something unusual or potentially harmful, it can do things like alert you, or even take action to address the threat. In essence, an EDR helps ensure that each device remains secure by actively looking out for and responding to potential dangers. But in order to do that, it often needs pretty in-depth levels of access. So when there is a risk of failure, that failure can be rather impactful. These systems are incredibly valuable. It's why even after a cyber attack happens, the investigators are able to triage and sleuth their way into figuring out the fine details of what happened on the system at the time it occurred. The thing is, an EDR solution like this is largely an enterprise product, meaning that it's meant for companies and organizations to use across the board. While you could technically put the product on your home system, it's not really the use case for a common person. Maybe if you've got a lab or you really want to test this stuff out, but people like your mom and dad, your family, they're not ever going to see something like Crowdstrike unless it's on their work laptop. So that bit right there, when this software caused the world to stop, that's why you probably didn't notice anything on your home computer or your home laptop. Speaking of causing the world to stop, what actually happened here? Well, flashback to July 19th. At this point, it's only a few weeks ago, so I know I'm asking a lot, but it's around 4 a.m. UTC. Crowdstrike pushed out what they call a rapid response content update. These rapid response updates aren't inherently versions of a software being delivered, but a set of critical behavioral pattern identification signatures. The Crowdstrike threat detection engineers will build these and deploy them in reaction to attacks and intelligence based on what's going on in the world, so that if it hits your machine, they can identify and respond to it. It's pretty reasonable, and it's how the platform is very reliable. Think back to our episodes on APTs, like Fancy Bear. If Fancy Bear is utilizing a new method to deliver ransomware to hosts, then Crowdstrike might analyze this, create a signature, and rapidly deploy it to make sure that teams can respond appropriately. These rapid response updates are stored in a proprietary file format that contains some configuration data that can map signatures to behaviors like blocking, observing, or alerting on it. They're a pretty common part of a threat identification and response lifecycle, despite the name making it feel like it's a critical drop to everything else that needs to be happening. But what was special about this one? Well, for that, I'm going to go to the report that Crowdstrike themselves published on the issue. Remember how I mentioned that rapid responses are delivered as templates? Those template types all represent a specific sensor capability, and their behavior is all configured dynamically for the content updates themselves. So when some new templates were deployed and systems started blue screening, people were frantically trying to figure out what the root cause was here. Microsoft and Crowdstrike have both come out to talk about this, but the analysis all seems to confirm that it was due to an out-of-bounds memory safety error in a specific file. What does that mean? According to Crowdstrike themselves, it means that it started a chain that, quote, when we received the sensor and loaded it into the content interpreter, problematic content in channel file 291 resulted in an out-of-bounds memory read, triggering an exception. This unexpected exception could not be gracefully handled, resulting in a Windows operating system crash or blue screen of death. Yeah, not gracefully handled is right. It's all to say that because there was no built-in way to handle this specific error properly, your computer just kinda stalled out if it was impacted. And let's step back again and talk about that impact, because like I said at the top of the show, this was one of, if not the most, disruptive cyber event to have occurred in the last 15 years. Let's give you all a little bit of context as to why I say that. We'll start with some broad numbers. It was estimated that over 8.5 million systems got hit. In the grand scheme of things, that's not a massive number, but because of who Crowdstrike does business with, it was a number of important groups. I'm going to run through piece by piece what some of the major impacts were to this. Let's start with some state issues. In many parts of the country, emergency services like 911 that relied on Windows machines to be a critical part of the infrastructure were hit. You might have seen some of your local authorities going to Facebook, X, or other social media platforms to post alternate direct lines for communication, since their intake systems for new calls were broken. In some places, entire broadcast stations for television were just left inoperable. Sky News in the United Kingdom went off the air for a little bit. There were problems in the US with several news stations as well, and even upon a partial restoration, there were still functions like graphics, teleprompters, and studio quality issues that were not entirely functional. Getting into a bit of some heavier hitting impacts, let's talk about flights. This is the one where there is some really interesting, demonstrable, and ongoing problems. This outage led to hundreds upon thousands of flights being canceled on that Friday. People were delayed days. Honestly, for me, it was a bit of a close call because I had a flight 12 hours prior to this and one a couple days later. Thankfully, I wasn't really impacted by this, but I hate to imagine what it would have looked like if I had chosen a different day for travel. The issues were global, and they impacted a wide variety of airlines. In an article on Mashable, Shannon Connellan reported that these airlines were all having issues and needed to ground flights. Airlines like Aegean Airlines, Air France, Allegiant, Akasa, American Airlines, Binter, Delta, Frontier, Indigo, Jetstar, KLM, Qantas, Ryanair, Singapore Airlines, SpiceJet, Sun Country, Swiss International, TAP Air Portugal, Turkish Airlines, United, Vueling, Wizz Air, and even some airports were left either partially or entirely closed, such as Logan Airport in Boston, a major hub on the east coast of the United States. You may have seen one graphic that's been making its way around the internet. It shows the flight maps just before, during, and after the outage. It's really eerie seeing what it looks like when a massive swarm of planes operating as normal quickly becomes a fraction of what it normally is. It honestly reminded me of when I was younger and they would display a similar graphic to show the sky clearing on September 11th. Slowly, just more and more planes landing with less and less taking off. If you go to the episode transcript at whattheshellpod.com, I've included a link to this. You can go take a look yourself, and I'll try to get it up on my socials too, so that you can see it everywhere. And while the impact to travel was bad, let's up it even more and talk about stock markets. While not as all or nothing as the airline industries, there were some issues with international stock markets because of this. The London Stock Exchange, for example, had to delay its opening to address the issue and allow for trading. This impact wasn't really felt as heavily in the United States, but it was still interesting to see how the international markets had to adapt to overcome this. And lastly, I want to talk about one of the more critical areas that got hit, as they always seem to do, healthcare. This one hits a little bit close to home. I used to work in healthcare information security, and these kind of outages that are caused by something out of your control can wreak havoc, not only on the systems, but on the regular people like you or I. Healthcare Dive reported that at least 11 healthcare organizations were experiencing problems. These are large institutions like Emory Healthcare, JFK Medical, Mass General Brigham, and Norton Healthcare. If hospitals weren't mostly down, they were often operating at an almost emergency-like condition, with day surgeries and non-critical procedures being postponed. And perhaps the hardest part for all these industries in responding to this wasn't the outage itself, but it was a recovery process. To respond quickly, teams needed to get their hands on the keyboards of the impacted systems. That means that in some cases, you had organizations with upwards of 100,000 machines and a support staff of probably only a couple hundred IT people max that needed to get out to each and every machine to get this done as quickly as possible. And again, let's not forget that this was on a Friday, so this meant that many help desk and support engineers were likely about to lose their entire weekend to this problem. Honestly, I hope they got more than a pizza party, because this just wasn't something your average end user could do by themselves, so you needed a good engineer to help. Eventually, there were some thrown together solutions for network booting and handling this remotely, but that didn't come right away, and they needed to be quick. What we're left with at the end of this is a disruption the likes of which many have never seen before. The damages are still being considered, but according to Parametrics, it cost over $5 billion in damages to Fortune 500 companies. And Delta? They're currently going back and forth with Crowdstrike publicly about the possibility of a lawsuit coming due to its $500 million impact. That's not even to consider the damage to Crowdstrike itself. If you look at the Crowdstrike's stock price from a month ago compared to now, well, they're down almost 40%, going from near $400 a share to as low as $229. I've got the whole chart for the past month up to August 6th in the episode transcript as well, so go take a look at that. And yes, towards the end of that, there is some market instability that's also at play, but There's no denying the hit that this took. There's fiscal damage, brand damage, reputational damage. It just keeps going. And one last thing you might have seen that tends to come with issues like this is the profiteering of malicious actors and hackers. Yes, we can't forget that in the wake of emergencies like this, there will always be those looking to make a buck. What we're seeing now are phishing cases where people are masquerading as Crowdstrike, trying to trick you into thinking that you're impacted even if you're not, and getting you to install malware on your own machine. I mean, this thing was so widespread that you've probably heard of it. You might not know if you have Crowdstrike, and they're just trying to convince you that you do. This whole operation isn't unusual, but it's getting an uptick in visibility because of the ongoing news reporting on the issue, and you see it with every kind of major news or event. If you recall, when I talked about the start of the Russia-Ukraine war, there were people profiteering off that as well. So what do I think is going to come from this? It's hard to say. At Crowdstrike, I imagined a couple of things would happen. There definitely seems like there's going to need to be some kind of turnover of leadership or accountability. Even if a lawsuit doesn't make its way to fruition, I imagine some executives are going to be pulling the ripcord on whatever exit package they can get. I also imagine that their internal test and quality assurance processes are going to receive a full audit, which will hopefully end in more support for the engineers on their teams. In the world at large, I think we'll probably start to see some more strict regulations in the coming years surrounding the liability after test and quality assurance. It's hard to imagine that some politician won't try to push forward with new rules surrounding what kind of processes should be followed and who's ultimately accountable for the fiscal damages if something slips through the cracks like this. I don't think it'll come soon, but I imagine those discussions are already starting as we speak. I do hope this was a wake-up call though, because while this wasn't a cyber attack, just a failure of processes, that doesn't mean that the next one won't be. It's scary to think about, but this demonstrates what a large-scale outage would look like around the world. We recovered pretty well this time, but that was when we knew the fix and the cause within minutes to hours of it happening. If I were a business, I'd be tabletopping our continuity plans and recovering procedures because, as with most disruptions in the cyber landscape, it's never really a question of if you'll be impacted, it's a question of when you'll be impacted. With that, I want to pivot to a different story that also had me interested in the past few weeks, that I thought maybe you all might find interesting as well. It's regarding a company called KnowBe4. That's KNOBE, the number 4. If that name seems familiar to you, then kudos to you because you've been here a while. I mentioned KnowBe4 way back in episodes 2 and 3 of What the Shell because it was a company that Kevin Mitnick went on to work heavily with before he passed away last year. And he was the first hacker that I really profiled on the show. Think of KnowBe4 as a company that helps businesses teach their employees how to stay safe online. Just like schools teach kids about good habits and safety, KnowBe4 helps companies train their staff to recognize and avoid online threats. Here's a little bit of a simple breakdown. They do training programs, where they offer online lessons and videos that explain common online threats, like phishing emails. These lessons show employees how to spot the threats and what to do if they encounter them. They offer practice tests. KnowBe4 can run an actual simulated phishing attack. That means that they'll send a fake phishing emails to employees to test their responses. I'm sure you've all probably gotten one of these, and if you haven't, then honestly your company is lagging a little bit. If an employee fails the test or falls for a fake attack, it's a sign that they need more training, and it's a practice drill here that's going to help them get better at identifying real threats. They improve security. By training these employees and running these practice tests, KnowBe4 can help business create a safer work environment. It's like giving everyone the knowledge and tools to avoid falling for an online scam and keeping the company's information secure. In short, KnowBe4 helps companies make sure that their employees are smart and prepared when it comes to online security. Which is why it was such an interesting story when they themselves came out about how a North Korean hacker was hired to their own IT team, slipping through the process and attempting to steal secrets. Attempting being the key word here. It should be noted that everything I'm about to cover as a part of the story here comes directly from KnowBe4 themselves, in a blog post that came out on their website on July 23rd, 2024, titled, Quote, how a North Korean fake IT worker tried to infiltrate us. So, we know what KnowBe4 does now, right? And that means you must be able to at least imagine, on some level, the scope of what they need to function. They need to maintain the research, they need to build the tech, potentially even offer multiple language support, and keep up with the times as things change. So it wasn't really all that surprising when earlier this year, KnowBe4 needed a software engineer for their own internal AI team. If you work in security right now, you know that AI enhancement is the hot ticket item for platforms at the moment. It's not really meaning to take a job away from you like some people would think. In most cases, it's meant to streamline and offer you some of the information that you were likely trying to ask for or would ask for first. So they continued through their normal hiring process to find someone to fill this role. They'd post the job, screen resumes, interview candidates, and when it got to the point where they had one picked out, they went through what one might expect and gave the background check and reference check a go. Nothing really appeared to be wrong, and the unnamed employee would be hired, but almost immediately upon logging in for the first time, something weird happened. The laptop that was provisioned for them almost immediately started to attempt to load malware. And here's the reason I decided to tell this story second. The reason this was caught was because the EDR solution in use at KnowBe4 caught the suspicious activity on the device at this stage and alerted their own cyber defense team. The suspicious activity started on July 15th around 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Now, if you're on a SOC, you might start thinking about how you would respond to an alert out of the blue like this. I think most people's first guess would be, oh god, what link did the new hire already click on? The security team got a hold of the new hire and asked what they were doing on the machine, to which he claimed that he was following steps on his router FAQ to troubleshoot some speed issues. It wasn't really the kind of answer you'd expect to hear or want to hear in this case, and all the while more and more alerts are being triggered. The security team is seeing attempts to alter session history files on the device, transfer files to the device, and execute unauthorized code. These are all items that would raise an alarm, and when it doesn't match up with what the user is saying they're doing, it sets off even more alarms. But again, I imagine that they weren't immediately leaping to a malicious actor, so they tried to get more details from him and getting him directly on the phone. But eventually he became unresponsive, and while he was unresponsive, the activity kept going. So about half an hour into this, at 10:20 p.m., the Security Operations Center isolated the new hire's device. This is something that the EDR can do to limit access and contain a threat. If they have reason to believe that the device has been compromised or that something isn't right, they can isolate it from the network, limit its access, and essentially put a cone of shame on it until they figure out if it needs to be wiped and what happened. And after the isolation here, it was pretty much close to done from the compromise standpoint. KnowBe4 severely limits a user's access if they're a new hire that hasn't done all their training anyways, so there was no access to or exfiltration of any sensitive data. Now, at this point, I'm going to say that this isn't really meant to be any kind of slam on KnowBe4, but a highlight of how nation states and bad actors try to infiltrate valid operations. I want to rewind a bit and talk about that whole infiltration process. What did they do? Well, this is the part that might freak some of you out, because it's an example of something that's probably going to be popping up more and more. It started with a stolen identity of a United States citizen. It doesn't really matter how it was stolen. It could have been a breach, could have been sold on the dark web, who knows, but someone's identity was taken. So the North Korean worker has a name and an identity. Next, they set up an address to attach the resume to. And this is going to come back later, but I'm going to put a pin in it for now. From here, they now have a different problem. How do you make yourself look legitimate? Well, the answer in this case was to take a stock image of a professional and use AI to dress it up a little bit. KnowBe4 posted the picture on their blog of the stock image and what it was altered to, and I have them on the website in the transcript, but I'll also toss them on the socials at shell_pod on Instagram. Here's where it gets even crazier. there were 4 rounds of video interviews done with this person. The AI enhanced picture looked enough like him, and the identity supplied on the application that there weren't any red flags to the interviewers. And even then, to all my people who are interviewing, how often is it that you're really putting that at the front of your mind? Really, you're there to assess technical and team aptitude, and while it should be someone's responsibility to follow up on this, it might not necessarily be yours. I know if I'm interviewing someone, my first thought isn't really, is this person who they're claiming to be? That might pop up if we see some red flags like looking off screen all the time or someone else being in the room, but it's not the first question I ask. So the hacker got by with this and was hired, giving the address that he had used for a fake identity to have his MacBook shipped to him. However, the hacker wasn't actually at that address. The address would have been a middle point full of other machines in the area that he could remote into from either North Korea or somewhere in China. So he was never actually really stateside, just working nights to make it look like he was online during our business hours. The combination of VPNing into a laptop farm that was actually in the country and being online during normal hours meant that from an access standpoint, it really didn't look super abnormal. According to KnowBe4 in the blog post, many of the scams like this operate twofold, where part of it is getting the persistent access to the network, and part of it is actually doing the job and making money, so that can be sent back to North Korea or wherever they're working from, and used for other illegal services and activities. So at the end of the day, a lot of the process worked well here. The EDR caught it, the team at KnowBe4 is actively working with law enforcement on this, which is why some of the details are scarce here, like not having a name. And KnowBe4 even changed some of their processes to make sure that this can't happen again. In fact, let me pull a couple items from their FAQ that they published in addition to that blog post that I think you might want to hear. The first question that I pulled was asked of them, and it said, quote, "Why would someone hired as a software developer try to load malware on their new machine?" And they answered, "We can only guess, but the malware was an info stealer, targeting data stored on web browsers, and perhaps he was hoping to extract information left on the computer before it was commissioned to him." This was a skillful North Korean IT worker, supported by state-backed criminal infrastructure, using the stolen identity of a US citizen, participating in several rounds of video interviews, and was able to circumvent background check processes commonly used by many companies. I'll take it back to me for a second because some of you might be wondering what information could be left on the computer. Hard to say, but maybe they're looking for some level of local admin from an initial provisioning standpoint. The other question I'm highlighting here was, has KnowBe4 changed anything in their hiring process after this? And they replied, "You bet we have. Several process changes were made so that this thing will be caught earlier. One example is that in the US, we will only ship new employee workstations to a nearby UPS shop and require a picture ID. So now that hacker would have needed a fake ID to match the fake name and stolen identity. It just makes it that much harder, and it means they have to be stateside for this. Or at least someone does. So there we have it. I think it's a good cautionary tale on multiple fronts. Make sure your EDR is alerting right and your teams respond well. Make sure your background checks are comprehensive. Maybe highlight some red flags. And consider changing your own processes if you think that there might be a gap similar to theirs. All in all, it was an interesting month in July for cyber events. We're just over half a year in, so let's see if we get anything else in the back half of 24 that comes even close to this. I'm John Cordes. That's this episode of What the Shell. Thanks to everyone for listening. It's good to be back. But before you go, I do want to ask if you can do me one favor. Since I'm just coming back, the show is going to have a bit of an uphill battle against the algorithm. So if you can rate the show, that would be super helpful to me, sincerely. Especially all you Spotify listeners. That seems to be my biggest user base. And if you liked this, maybe share it with someone that you think might enjoy it too if they don't know about it. I've rebuilt the show's Discord. You can find a link to it in the episode description. And to anyone going out to Vegas this weekend for DEF CON, I hope you all have a great time. I won't be there this year, but I'm planning on coming back next year. If you are there, make sure you say hi to Jack Resider from Darknet Diaries. He's doing a bunch of cool events that you can check out on his Discord or socials. That's it for this week. See you all in the middle of August.